Okay. Good evening, everybody. Does the sound okay? Yes, no? Okay. Very good. Okay, so we are going to look at a topic which we have spoken about before, but I would like to focus on again and perhaps expand on a little bit. The subject is what is called essentially, in the language of Kabbalah, it's called birur or ha'alat hanitzotzot, raising up the sparks of holiness. Now, let me just explain the background to what that really means, and then we'll go into it in somewhat more depth. Right in the beginning of creation, after the words Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning God created. So the words appear. The next verse states as follows. V'ha'aretz, after the first verse, the second verse of the first chapter of Genesis. V'ha'aretz ha'as tohu v'avohu, the existence, land, literally, was tohu and vohu. It was in a state of chaos. V'choshech al pnei ha'tahom, and there was darkness over the deep. Ruach Elokim rachefet al pnei ha'mayim, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. There's various other minor ways, differences in translations that you could find, but it's enough for our purposes. The whole point of chaos and void. What was chaos and void? The creation was in a state of chaos and void. Why? Because it was right at the beginning of creation, before things had been properly formed. But the Kabbalah comes along and explains that it was actually there were several worlds created before our world. In other words, when I say our world, I'm not just including our physical world, but the spiritual worlds that we're familiar with, the worlds of that are spoken about in Kabbalah, which are Atzilut, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. Right, the four planes of existence, or four worlds. The world of Atzilut, which comes from the word Eitzel, which means close, the world that is close to God, in the sense that that's the world in which godliness is revealed. The world of creation, Bria, the world of formation, Yetzira, and then the world of action, which is the world of Asiya, of which this physical world is the lowest counterpart. The lowest aspect of. Okay, so those are the four worlds, and when we said that that the worlds had not yet been fully formed, none of those worlds had yet been fully formed. We're talking about worlds that were created before that. The primary world, the first creation, the primary creation, is called, figuratively speaking, Adam Kadmon. Primordial or primeval man in quotes. It doesn't really mean man. It simply means that was created in the likeness of God. Right? Was created in the likeness of God. That's why the word Adam is from the word Adama, or Adameh rather, to be like, to look like, to be alike. A demut is a likeness, an appearance. Okay, so that world of Adam Kadmon was then further subdivided into other worlds. I'm not going to go into all the details because it's not really necessary, but one of those worlds, which was called the world of Nikudim, the world of points. There was point-like structures which were each incredibly intense and unmixed with any of the others. There were various points. The rudimentary form of the Sfirot, but the Sfirot in such a permutation that they did not affect one another, they didn't work together. Each Sfirah worked on its own, so to speak. And those Sfirot, of all those 10 Sfirot of the world of Tohu, the bottom 7 smashed and fell. They broke. Now, their breaking was not an unintentional thing. As the Talmud tells us, God created in order to destroy and destroyed in order to recreate. That is referring to the world of Tohu. The world of Tohu was created in order to be destroyed, and then it was destroyed in order to be recreated. Now, why then is it necessary to destroy it in order to? It's created already. Why not just leave it the way it is? Well, because God wanted us to partake in the creation, to take part in the creation, to be part of the creative process. So therefore, he let the lights, the way it's explained in Kabbalah, he let the lights overwhelm the vessels so that the vessels smashed. Just as if, so to speak, by way of analogy, if you would run an electric current at a very high current through an ordinary light bulb, the light bulb would simply smash. It wouldn't be able to take a very high current. And that's why it has to be stepped down to the level of whatever it is, 60, 120 volts, and then your whatever. Okay, so you understand the analogy. So the point being that God did that in order to smash apart that world so that sparks of light, which are called the nitzutzot, these are the sparks of holiness, should fall down into lower levels of creation in order that they would be lifted up by us in the process of recreation, of putting things back together. You probably know the song Humpty Dumpty, fell off, Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall, fell off, and all the king's horses and all king's men couldn't put him together again, right? You know the old rhyme, I'm sure, or maybe you don't, but that's very common in England and where I come from, South Africa originally. So in any event, the whole point here is that we do put it together, right? Not that Humpty Dumpty can't be put together again. The world of Tohu must be put together again. That's why one of the purposes of our being created, that's why we're here, to reconstruct the world of Tohu in order to participate in the creation of the Almighty. The Almighty's creation, he doesn't want to keep for himself, so to speak. He wants us to participate. And the way we do that is by reconnecting those sparks of holiness that fell through the smashing of the world of Tohu, the breaking of the vessels of the world of Tohu. That's what we do. So, the ultimate question, therefore, is, well, how do we do that? How do we actually elevate these sparks? So the good news is that the Israelites in Egypt actually elevated 202 of the 288. There are 288 general sparks. They subdivide and subdivide and subdivide and subdivide until they become embedded in all of creation, essentially. But through their slavery in Egypt, the Israelites were actually able to locate and elevate 202 of those sparks. That's called the Erev Rav, or the mixed multitude, but the way it's explained in Kabbalah is that the word Rav, in Hebrew, Resh Bet, the numerical value of that word is 202. The Erev Rav Aleitam, the 202 of those sparks of the 288 that were embedded in creation were already elevated, leaving us only 86. So that's the good news. We have only 86 left to do. The bad news is that these are the most difficult to access and the most difficult to elevate. So, practically speaking, how do we actually elevate these sparks? Like, what is the trick? First of all, how do we find them? Where are they? How do we find them? How do we know that these are sparks at all? Like, you don't walk around and see sparks coming out of, unless you're in Hawaii right now and looking at a certain mountain in of the big island, but you don't see sparks coming out of anywhere. What does this mean? Well, it doesn't mean literally sparks, of course. It means some sort of life force. Some life force, it sparks in the sense that it's light or divine energy, which is akin to, or sometimes given the nickname of light. And because there are very minuscule portions of that divine energy, they're called sparks, just like sparks off a fire. right? Very small pieces of fire, so to speak. Okay, so what happens then is that these sparks are actually embedded within creation, and we find them in the following way. Now, this is the very important part. This is the very important thing to think about. How do we find the sparks? Well, we don't have to find them. They come to us. Sparks come to those who are ready and waiting to elevate them. They come to you. You don't have to go to them. Okay, so how does this work? Well, the Kabbalistic works explain as follows. They say that when a person has a sudden, let's say a sudden desire, or maybe not so sudden, but it could be something that happened many, many times before, but a person has a desire for a particular thing. Not just a regular desire, but he's lusting for something. So what is that lust? We aren't aware that lust is not a physical need per se. Right? The body, of course, needs nourishment. And in order to be able to nourish ourselves, we have to eat food and drink liquids and so on and so forth. But the bare needs that we have could easily be fulfilled. Instead of having a slice of pizza, one could have something much more, much healthier, and probably, packing less calories and so on and so forth. Just regular food. You could eat a salad, right? Okay, so the point being that in order to survive, a lot of the things that we consume, we don't really need. We could make do with other things that are probably much better for us. But the reason that we lust for them or desire them or want them in the first place, we're not just talking about once when a person is hungry, he has to eat. He or she has to eat. But we're talking about the idea of a desire which is, to some extent, let's say it's dominating you. The desire dominates you. Instead of you dominating it, it dominates you. That's what is called, I believe, in the 12 steps for Alcoholics Anonymous, that's what they call a lust. One lusts after something. It's not something you need, it's a lust. It's a very, very strong desire. So, the Kabbalistic works go on to explain that if a person has a lust for something, know that within that something is hidden the spark that you need, that is yours to elevate. The question is, how do you elevate it now? Well, there's two ways you can elevate it. If the spark is for something, if the lust is for something that is forbidden according to the Torah, so for Jewish people, something like pork or a cheeseburger or whatever, things like that, right, which are forbidden to us. So then you know that the only way to rectify that spark is to completely have nothing to do with it. To have nothing to do with it. I'm not going to consume it. I'm not going to have anything to do with it. And there's various gradations of if it's forbidden to derive any benefit from it, called Isur Hanoah, or if it's just forbidden to eat it, Isur Achila, and so on. There's various gradations. We don't have to go into that now. So when a person has a very strong lust for something, a lust for something, know that that is because of the spark that is hidden in that thing. And the first way of elevating that spark is to not deal with it at all. In other words, stay away. That is if the object is something forbidden. This could be forbidden foods. It could also be forbidden, sorry, my phone is going off over here. It could also be forbidden sexual activities, forbidden words. What are forbidden words? Forbidden words are not only swear words and four-letter words and things like that, which are also forbidden words. They They're not forbidden in the true sense of forbidden. They just make you dirty. So we don't use them, or at least we try not to. And but when we talk about forbidden words, we mean like saying things that are evil speech, saying something negative about somebody else out of spite or out of hatred or out of dislike or out of nastiness or whatever. Sometimes it's necessary. For instance, if a person is going to do harm to themselves or somebody else, then it's necessary to speak out about it and to tell someone who could do something about it that this person is going to cause harm. But simply, what we mean here is what is in the category of what is called lashon hara, evil speech, evil tongue. In other words, saying nasty things about other people, often behind their backs, not necessarily to their faces, that are absolutely of no benefit other than that you can gloat over it afterwards. There's no benefit to saying such a statement. These statements are forbidden. They're actually forbidden by the Torah to talk about people in negative ways. Okay, so it could be forbidden sexual acts. It could be forbidden incest, rape, things like that. It could be forbidden speech. It could be even forbidden thoughts, forbidden things that we are forbidden to think about. For instance, idolatry and so on. I don't want to get into those specific categories now, but just in a general sense, these forbidden things are to be, the way of elevating them is to avoid them. To avoid them. However, there is a category of things which are not forbidden. They are just not yet holy. They're just simply physical things. Like, for example, let's just take the simplest example, food which is kosher. You're allowed to eat it. And you can eat it at any time, unless it's a particular fast day like Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and so on, when we fast the whole day, the 9th of Av. But in general, things that can be elevated are things that are permissible to us, generally permissible. So, how then do you elevate it? When a person gets a lust for something which is not forbidden, but which is permitted, then the thing to do is to focus on that lust. What kind of lust is this? What kind of lust is this? If it's to do harm to another person, let's say, then that's coming from the Sphira of Gevura. The Sphira of Gevura, let me just get a chart up on the board here. Okay. Can everyone see? Here's Gevura. Okay? Gevura. Let's see here what the chat says. 1 second, let me see here. Yes, all right, so you can see. Okay, I'll get to that in a minute, Andrea. What if the object, Andrea is asking, what other object is a person? Is it possible that a person has a spark we need to elevate? I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so let's, for example, take the concept of Gvura. So where is that lust coming from? Is it coming from one of these negative traits, from anger, from jealousy, from hatred? Or is it coming, let's say, from lust or from self-love, right? Negative traits. Or is it coming from defiance? Is it coming from anxiety, from stubbornness, from worry? Is it coming from deviousness, lying, cheating, etc., etc., etc.? Right? All of these have their boastfulness, pride, arrogance, and so on. If that is the negative quality, then what one has to do is focus instead on the positive quality. For example, if a negative quality is anger, jealousy, hatred, one has to focus on awe of the Almighty, or on a higher level. In other words, transform that negative emotion, that negative trait, into a positive thing. Let's take another example, the concept of lust, or self-love. That's the emotion of love in general, but that emotion of love in general, which is in this case a negative one, self-love, can be transformed into emotional connection up above, to love up above, or to love of your fellow human being, to love of a member of your family. It can be, self-love can be transformed into love of the right sort. Love for the right things, love for the right ideas, love for the right people, and so on and so forth. Love for the Almighty, love for goodness and kindness, and so on and so forth, with all of the negative qualities. If a person is, for example, devious, a devious person, so what should a devious person do to overcome that deviousness? Use the deviousness in a positive way. In other words, to be arum, as the verse goes, arum b'chokhmah, to be devious in acquiring wisdom. In other words, to take the wisdom from its place where it's hidden in negative things, and bring it into the realm of the positive. That could be the opposite quality, like sincerity, the opposite of deviousness, or acknowledgement. The opposite of deviousness could also be truth. But in any event, to take that deviousness, lying, and cheating, and to become a person who is very tremendous sincerity, and as our sages expressed it, his outside is like his inside, and his inside is like his outside. The outside and the inside match. In other words, it's not one thing on the outside and something different on the inside, right? It matches both. In other words, as the expression goes, such a person doesn't have a split in them. They don't have a split because the outside and the inside are the same. A person whose outside and inside are not the same has a kind of a split between the two. Okay, so in other words, if one recognizes in oneself, and there has to be a certain amount of self-introspection to be able to understand what that quality is, what that lust is, or what that habit sometimes is, then one can take it and elevate it up above. Now, sometimes it's hard for one to do this on one's own because a person is close to himself and doesn't herself and doesn't see how to rectify. In that case, you need a teacher or a guide to be able to show you where you're going wrong and what you can do about it. So that's a possibility, but it's possible that a person might be able to recognize it themselves and then transform it in the right way. For example, let's take another example: alienation and loneliness. Alienation and loneliness is a thing that affects a huge amount of people today. And if one can only take that loneliness and transform it, turn it around into being alone with God, in other words, what is called dveikut, cleaving to God, being alone, being at one and alone with God, then one doesn't feel alone anymore. There's no loneliness anymore. And the same thing applies to being to attaching oneself in a positive way, not in a negative way, but attaching oneself to another person out of care for them, out of contributing to their well-being, contributing to their enjoyment of life, and so on and so forth. This is the transformation of that particular midah, that particular quality, that negative quality into positive quality. Let me just take a couple of questions. What if the object is a person? That same thing could also be transformed. It depends on how it is. If it's a negative lust, let's say, for another person, what do? Then the way to go about it, probably one has to think about it very carefully, because this is a delicate issue. But let's say a person has a lust for another, but it's really ultimately it's a sexual lust. Right? Let's say, just for example, well, sexual lusts are really found over here in Yesod. That's where they are. Yesod corresponds in the male to the male organ and the female to the female organ, right? Organ of reproduction. So then what is the lust for that? The lust is not to necessarily have a sexual encounter with that person, but to be able to merge with another person, become one with another person, and thereby becoming whole. The reason for physical sexual lust very often is because we don't feel ourselves to be whole. We feel ourselves to be alienated, to be lonely, to be incomplete. So the way to deal with that is to contribute to others in such a way that you make them complete. To nurture somebody else, not necessarily the person who you lust for. That's just one example. There are many others that that we could many other ways we could sort of cut this, but let's say it's not a physical thing, but it's not a physical lust for somebody for some kind of sexual encounter, but it is it's admiration for a person. Well, there's nothing wrong with admiring a person, but if it's excessive, perhaps, if it's excessive, then perhaps the admiration could be turned to something up above. In other words, admiration for the Almighty, right? Okay. Let me just take another couple of questions. Is God, you're talking about a physical person or spiritual or both? It could be either. It could be either. It could be both. One of the biblical phrases, actually not from the Bible itself, but I think it's from Mishlei, which says "Chua berov yo'etz." Salvation comes about through much advice, like getting advice from other people. So salvation comes about, salvation in a personal sense, not in a ultimate redemption kind of a sense, but salvation from a situation, from an individual situation, comes about through rov yo'etz, through much advice and discussion and asking for help. Okay. Another example, when my grandkids live in my house and they fight with me, I get angry and talk to my wife, and then one with them, without them in the room, that is wrong too. I've talked to them, but they won't listen. Well, kids are, unfortunately, kids are kids, and it's hard to get them to listen. There is a certain person who really teaches people how to listen. I'm just trying to think of his name now. Marshall. Just one second. I'll find it in a second. Let me just look online here. Just forget his name for a minute. Oh, what's going on here? Marshall Rosenberg. Yeah, that's it. Marshall Rosenberg. He has a thing called nonviolent communication. Here, let me share a screen. See all my secrets here, but anyway, never mind. Share a screen here. Marshall Rosenberg, Nonviolent Communication Workshop. Right, it's a 3-hour workshop, but listen to it. And you'll learn. He has a 9-hour workshop. It's worth going through the 3-hour one. I haven't been through the 9-hour one myself, but he basically gets a coyote and a giraffe puppets, and he hasn't talked to each other. One talks like a coyote and one talks like a giraffe. A giraffe. I don't know why I chose giraffe. Maybe those are the only puppets you could find, but you'll see. He explains it. He explains it himself. He actually explains very well. But that's how to do it. One does it by knowing how to dialogue. In other words, you can still express what it is that you need. I need quiet in the house, kids, or whatever it is. But there's a way of expressing it that doesn't put them on the defensive. And that's what he teaches, nonviolent communication. Very, very important skill to learn. Someone is asking here, do I have someone that I learn from similar to how? Yes, I do. I do. I have my, it's called my mashpia, and I ask him things on a personal basis when I have issues that I need to confront, and I speak to him. Yeah. I have actually more than one teacher, but there's one that I speak to when it comes to these kinds of things. Very, very level-headed person. When I lived in Israel, it was somebody else. Also a very, very level-headed person, but yes, I think it's very important. There's a whole concept which is called Asel Harav, make for yourself a mentor, right? Make for yourself a mentor. And you find this that, interestingly enough, business people do that. Business people are not, successful business people, are not averse to finding somebody who they can discuss issues with, and we're not just going to be, whitewash everything. We're going to tell them the truth the way they see it. They're going to tell them the truth the way they see it, and therefore they'll be able to rectify themselves and improve themselves. A very important skill. So, I mean, people in professions also have this, psychologists that have a psychologist who they talk to. Doctors who have doctors that they talk to, just to discuss things. So it shouldn't always be a one-sided point of view and what I think, and that's it. And of course, in spiritual matters, that is vital that one do that. Okay, let's move on. So to be clear, the sparks that are hidden are not really hidden within the thing lusted for, but sort of points out what we need to master. Is that right? Yes, that is absolutely right. Now, let me just qualify that a little bit. There's a sort of a thing going on around now. Well, you've probably seen it before. You've seen similar things before. Sometimes you see that sort of the picture of a candlestick, and if you look one way, it's a candlestick. If you look another way, it's two faces looking at each other. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, that kind of thing. So they have new things going around that apply to sound and apply to colors. I have a pair of shoes. How do I know this? Because my kids send me these things. A pair of shoes that some people will see as green, gray and green, gray with green trim, and other people will see them as dusty pink and white, right? How's that possible? Well, because you're associated with certain things for some reason or another. Different people see things differently. Now, the same thing happens with certain sounds. One person hears one sound, another person hears it differently. Now, how does that happen? Well, I don't know exactly how it happens, but it happens. There's obviously something to do with perception that changes between people. So, to answer your question, Wendy, when one person looks at a certain object, there's no lust that arises in him for that thing. Why? Because that spark is not calling out to that person for rectification. It's the spark that calls out the person. That's why you have that strong, very strong pull towards it. Now, that pull towards it can pull you down also. That's why you got to be very careful. It can pull you down. And that's where one has to stop at the edge and think to yourself, what is it that you're doing? Are you being pulled after the spark, or are you going to pull the spark after you elevate it? Bring it up into holy usefulness. Make it used for something holy. Now, how does that relate to the world of chaos? The world of chaos was where the sparks actually originated, but the breaking of the vessels in the world of chaos. It's not tense. You can ask questions. Don't why get down on yourself? There's no questions are always ways of finding out the truth. They're not. No question is stupid. So, okay, let's continue. To elevate these sparks, could this point to turning around the selfish desire to bestow or give? Yes. When your question is far from dense, but rather profound. Yes, there you see, you see. Good. That sounds a lot like Rabash about making yourself a mentor. Yes, this is a time-honored tradition. It's not only a tradition, but it is an exhortation which is found already in the Mishnah. In the Mishnah, in the Ethics of the Father, the Mishnah was written about the beginning of the 3rd century, the end of the 2nd century, beginning of the 3rd century, by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Judah the Prince. He wrote down all the oral teachings in 6 tractates, 6 orders of the Mishnah. It's called the 6 Sidrei Mishnah, the 6 orders of the Mishnah. So one of the orders of the Mishnah, in one of the orders of the Mishnah, the orders are divided into tractates. One of the tractates is called Pirkei Avot, the ethics or the teachings of the forefathers, right? Of the fathers, teachings of the fathers. In other words, of our ancestors. And one of them says like this: Asei lecha rav, right? Make for yourself a mentor, uknei lecha chaver, and acquire for yourself a friend. Very important, 2 very, very important things. Find for yourself a mentor and make yourself a friend. Find a friend who you can have heart-to-heart talks with. A mentor is someone who's going to lift you up. A friend is someone who's going to listen to you. And will sometimes, hopefully not too often, offer a critical eye towards your thoughts. That can also be a good thing, but that's holy usefulness. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so you have to have a mentor. A very, very ancient teaching. We see that even before that, even before the time of the Mishnah, before the Mishnah codified it as make for yourself a mentor. We see that in the story of Jethro, Yitro in the parasha. The Jewish people all gather around Moses on a daily basis, and people are spending from the beginning of the day to the end of the day, basically asking him questions to do with how they need to improve themselves and many different other things. So then Jethro advises Moses to divide things up. He can't, respond to a couple million people all in every day. So he has to divide it up, into those who are in charge of thousands, in charge of hundreds, in charge of tens, and so on and so forth. The advice of Jethro, which was accepted. Okay, so when we raise a spark, is it raised for us individually or the collective as a whole? It's raised for the collective as a whole. It has an individual benefit for you too, but it's not just an individual thing. If I look for a red book with a title and cannot find it in the library until I discovered it was blue, and saw it 59 times until I admitted it wasn't red, it was blue, right? I've been there, done that, right? That happens, yeah. Because in your mind's eye, it's for some reason or another, it's a blue book and it's not a red one, and therefore you gloss over it when you're looking for it. That happens, yeah. All right, so just to finish off this idea, the whole idea of elevating the sparks is that when all the sparks are elevated, that is the time of restoration. That's the time when things will return to the way they were planned to be. In other words, the vessels will all be rebuilt, but now they will be able to accept these extremely powerful lights, these extremely powerful revelations, this extremely powerful revelation of God, and will not shatter again. And that is ultimately what we're all trying to do, to reconstruct I suppose you could call it paradise, although paradise is not really what it's about. But just figuratively speaking, I suppose you could say that it's reconstructing the world of Tohu, putting it all back together, so that the vessels will now be able to contain. Why? Because we've added something. It wasn't just that the vessels. Initially, the vessels were just passive, and that's why they fell apart. Now the vessels are put together in an active way. That active activity that we involved ourselves in reconstitutes the vessels in a way that they're now able to receive on a much higher level, and therefore a much higher level of light. Okay, I think we're going to have to leave it at that. I hope that yes, it could be that it now has a general tikkun after your action, but the 288 sparks, of which only 86 were left after Egypt, after the exodus from Egypt, only 86 were left, but they subdivided and subdivided and subdivided. So probably, most probably, what you have elevated when you've elevated something is a subdivision, a sub spark, and so on. And that's how it goes. Yeah. Okay, folks, have a good weekend. The festival, the holiday of Shavuot is coming up on Sunday and Monday, right after Shabbat. So those of you who celebrate the festival of the giving of the Torah should have a great festival and a great spiritual and elevating experience. May you receive the Torah inwardly and with joy. Okay, folks, see you all next Thursday, God willing.